The lights were hot and the audience was buzzing, but there was something off in the air before Clint Eastwood even stepped onto the stage. Jimmy Fallon had been unusually jittery during the opening monologue, throwing glances toward his producers and mumbling jokes that didn't land. But no one expected what came next. What was meant to be a casual celebratory interview honoring Eastwood's storied career quickly turned into one of the most uncomfortable segments in the show's history. Clint, dressed in his usual rugged simplicity, walked on stage to polite applause. But as he sat down, Fallon made an off-the-cuff remark, intended to be lighthearted, that instantly soured the atmosphere. It was a reference to Clint's age, delivered with the kind of smugness that turns a friendly jab into an insult. Clint's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The audience laughed out of habit, not realizing they were witnessing the first crack in what would become a volatile confrontation. Fallon, oblivious or pretending to be, kept pushing. He leaned into another comment, this time joking about Eastwood's relevance in modern Hollywood. That's when Clint raised an eyebrow, leaned forward in his chair, and asked Jimmy a pointed question. Not a rhetorical one, not a joke. It was the kind of question meant to wound. The laughter died. Jimmy's face stiffened as he tried to maintain his host persona, but Clint wasn't letting him off the hook. From that moment, the tone of the show changed entirely. This was no longer a late-night puff piece. Clint Eastwood, who had once commanded sets with a whisper, was now commanding the entire stage with quiet fury. His voice was low but firm as he reminded Jimmy, and everyone watching, that respect isn't optional just because someone is sitting in a guest chair. Jimmy tried to recover, changing the subject to Clint's new project, but the damage had already been done. Clint called out the network's history of underestimating people like him, and while he didn't name names, everyone knew what he was implying. The crowd grew tense, unsure of whether to clap, laugh, or stay silent. The crew behind the scenes were frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the drama play out. Fallon attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but it only made things worse. Every attempt to lighten the mood came off as patronizing. Clint, fed up with the artificial pleasantries, began to critique the entire show format. He accused it of valuing viral moments over meaningful dialogue, and called Jimmy out for caring more about audience laughs than authenticity. The audience sat stunned, caught between awkward silence and a creeping sense that something real was finally being said. Fallon, finally feeling the sting of humiliation on his own turf, snapped back. He defended his show, then took a jab at Clint's recent box office numbers, a move that crossed the line from passive aggression into open disrespect. Clint didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in closer, speaking with the kind of force that doesn't require volume. It was a veteran calling out a lightweight, and everyone in the room felt it. The producers were in panic mode. A segment that should have been warm and nostalgic had become a live standoff. No one dared cut to break. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting to see if Clint would walk off, or if Jimmy would break under pressure. But Clint didn't walk. Not yet. He had more to say. And as the second segment loomed, it was clear that whatever civility remained was about to be stripped away. As the commercial break came and went, the air in the studio felt heavier than before. Jimmy Fallon adjusted his collar, trying to smile, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Clint Eastwood hadn't cooled down during the break. He had only grown more resolute. When the cameras came back on, the polite masks were gone. This wasn't late-night charm anymore, it was personal. Jimmy, still grasping for control, made a snide attempt to reframe the awkward moment as a generational misunderstanding. He suggested that maybe Clint just didn't get how humor works today, implying the world had moved on from Eastwood's brand of seriousness. Clint tilted his head slightly, that unmistakable glare fixed on Fallon like a warning shot. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he laid into Fallon's character, questioning the kind of man who hides behind jokes when he feels threatened. It was brutal, and for the first time Jimmy's confidence faltered. The crowd, unsure whether they were still supposed to laugh, fell silent again. Clint leaned forward and questioned how someone could claim to lead meaningful conversations when they were too afraid to speak without a script. The accusation landed like a punch. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, and this time, he didn't try to deflect with a joke. He fired back, calling Clint's attitude outdated and accusing him of taking himself too seriously. He painted Clint as a relic, someone who used to be relevant but now clung to his past, as if it still commanded the same respect. It was vicious and clumsy, and everyone in the room knew it. Jimmy had crossed a line, not just with Clint, but with the audience, who had come expecting entertainment, not a dismantling. Clint didn't flinch. He turned it around, accusing Jimmy of being part of a machine that tears down people the moment they stop being useful for ratings. He told the host, bluntly, that fame built on mockery wasn't fame at all. It was cowardice, dressed in applause. The crowd murmured. Some were uncomfortable. Others, surprisingly, clapped. Jimmy was losing grip. He tried to reset the energy with a forced laugh and an awkward shift toward Eastwood's charity work, but Clint refused the distraction. He wasn't there to play along. He pointed out how the show had reduced every guest into a punchline or a caricature, and how no one seemed to care until someone pushed back. He questioned whether Jimmy had ever meant a single word he said on camera, or if he simply performed sincerity the way an actor performs grief. The room was now fully immersed in the storm. Clint wasn't being rude for the sake of drama. He was cutting through the artificiality with precision. Jimmy, clearly rattled, reached for his mug and took a slow sip to mask the nervous twitch in his jaw. Clint watched him with a calm that only made the moment more terrifying. It was the calm of a man who had nothing to lose and no reason to hold back. Jimmy's facade cracked further. He shot back that maybe Clint should stick to directing dusty westerns instead of trying to lecture the modern world on ethics. A few gasps echoed through the studio. Clint, without missing a beat, responded by listing the names of guests Fallon had platformed, not because they had anything to say, but because they drew controversy. It wasn't just an insult, it was an indictment. Then, with the precision of a courtroom prosecutor, Clint called out the culture of the show, its shallowness, and how it failed to elevate anything worth remembering. His words echoed in the stunned silence. Jimmy stared at him, visibly angry now, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk like a man trying not to explode on live television. The audience could sense it. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a breakdown, a rupture between two men representing entirely different eras and values. And as Jimmy looked into Clint's eyes, he saw something that unsettled him more than rage. He saw disappointment, and that cut deeper than anything said out loud. The interview was supposed to wrap after the next break, but nobody knew what would happen now. The producers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or let the chaos continue. Clint wasn't done yet. He had one final point to make, and Fallon would have to sit through it whether he liked it or not. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be about ratings. It would be about reckoning. By now, the crew backstage had stopped pretending everything was fine. Eyes darted between producers, sound engineers, and lighting techs, everyone waiting for a signal, some hint that this was still salvageable. But the damage had been done, and neither man showed any sign of backing down. The show had derailed into something raw and unscripted, and the audience could feel it. It wasn't just tense, it was historic. As Clint adjusted in his seat, his gaze didn't leave Fallon. His expression had gone colder, not angry but surgical. He asked Jimmy, directly and without hesitation, why he brought guests like him on the show at all. Was it to honor them, or was it to diminish them with thinly veiled mockery and hollow applause? Jimmy tried to smile, but it looked like a man wearing a mask made of cracking glass. There was no humor left to hide behind. Jimmy shifted in his chair, suddenly feeling smaller under the weight of the moment. He spoke slowly, defensively, trying to explain that his jokes were never meant to offend, that it was just part of the show, the way things had always worked. But Clint wasn't interested in excuses. He told Jimmy that the world didn't need more passive comedians playing diplomat while disguising disrespect as humor. The audience was dead quiet, captivated. Clint's words were not just about a late-night interview. They were about something larger. The entire entertainment industry. The way people are built up only to be torn down for views, how sincerity is treated like a weakness, and how people with real things to say are interrupted by laughter tracks before they can finish a thought. Jimmy finally snapped. His voice rose. His hand slammed the desk. He accused Clint of coming on the show looking for a fight, that the entire thing had been a setup to make Jimmy look like a fool. His tone was sharp now, defensive and erratic, no longer the composed host America was used to seeing. He told Clint that people like him were the problem, always dragging the past into the present and pretending it still mattered. The moment those words left his mouth, the crowd reacted. It was the first time since the clash began that there were audible boos. Not loud, not overwhelming, but just enough to rattle Jimmy. Clint raised his chin, stone-faced, as the tension settled like smoke in the studio. Then Clint did something unexpected. He didn't lash back. He didn't return the insult. Instead, he spoke calmly, reflecting on what it meant to age in an industry that discards people the moment they stop trending. He spoke about watching friends disappear, not because they lost their talent, but because the world no longer saw value in them. His voice dropped, almost becoming a whisper, and for a moment, the hostility gave way to something even more powerful: grief. Jimmy didn't interrupt. For the first time since Clint walked onto the stage, he didn't have a response. Maybe he realized he had crossed a line, or maybe he just didn't know what to say to a man who had seen more, lost more, and carried more weight in a sentence than Fallon could in an entire monologue. But the silence didn't last long. Jimmy, cornered and bruised by the emotional impact, scrambled to shift control back to himself. He mocked Clint's tone, accused him of turning the show into a lecture, and rolled his eyes as if the entire moment had been an act. It was a last-ditch effort to reclaim the upper hand. But it backfired spectacularly. Clint didn't raise his own voice, but the disappointment in his tone cut deeper than any insult. He told Jimmy that this interview would be remembered, not for the ratings, not for the laughs, but for revealing the exact kind of man hiding behind the host's desk. A man so terrified of sincerity, he would rather drown it in sarcasm than confront it head-on. The audience, who had been trapped in the spectacle, now leaned in for something more. This wasn't just drama. This was truth. And while Jimmy might have owned the stage, Clint was owning the moment. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the intensity etched across both men's faces. What had started as banter had spiraled into a philosophical collision, a generational reckoning. And it wasn't finished yet, because Clint had one more truth to share. And the most brutal part of the interview was still to come. Jimmy's fingers drummed against his desk now, not rhythmically but nervously. He could feel it, the subtle shift in the room, the audience's allegiance drifting toward Clint. It wasn't because of fame or nostalgia. It was because, beneath all the confrontation, Eastwood was speaking like a man who had lived too much and watched too many people forget the cost of silence. But Jimmy wasn't done trying. He leaned back in his chair, posture tense, and tried to flip the narrative. He asked Clint why he even agreed to come on the show if he felt so above it. That was when Clint stood up. Not walked off. Stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. But the sight of him standing, still and firm, froze the entire room. There was a storm behind his eyes, but his words came slow, deliberate. He explained that he came on the show not for Jimmy, not for the camera, but because people still cared about truth, and someone had to say it out loud. He said that too many voices in Hollywood had gone soft, traded principle for comfort, and allowed mediocrity to rise under the disguise of likability. Jimmy interrupted, claiming that Clint had no right to judge the present when his past was filled with privilege, control, and outdated ideals. That was when Clint stepped closer. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but with the quiet intensity of a man who'd spent decades watching the world twist itself into caricature. He began listing the very things Jimmy had allowed to slip through, under the guise of entertainment. Shallow interviews, celebrity gossip parading as journalism, and the mockery of real pain for applause. He pointed out that Jimmy, for all his charm, had never taken a real stand on anything until he was cornered, and now, with an audience watching, all he could do was squirm behind a smirk that was beginning to fall apart. Jimmy's defense cracked. His usual laughter lines turned rigid, his face flushed. He shouted this time. He accused Clint of walking into his house, insulting him in front of his own audience, and pretending to be the moral compass of an industry that had already moved on from him. He said Clint's legacy was built on silence, on men who never cried, never questioned, and certainly never admitted when they were wrong. Clint didn't blink. He told Jimmy that silence wasn't weakness, that sometimes it was strength, the kind of strength that lets other people speak. That not everything needed to be a joke. That sometimes men didn't cry, not because they lacked emotion, but because the world expected them to keep standing when no one else could. The studio. Lights seemed harsher now. The set no longer a place for laughter but a battlefield. And Jimmy Fallon, once so assured, looked genuinely shaken. For the first time, he didn't know how to steer the moment. The safety net of applause had vanished. His monologue cards were useless. All he had left was the truth laid bare in front of him. Then Clint dropped the final blow, not with anger, but with brutal honesty. He told Jimmy that legacy isn't defined by how many people clap for you, but by what remains when the noise fades. That long after the hashtags and laugh tracks vanish, people will remember whether you stood for something or just entertained until the lights went out. The silence after that was not awkward. It was reverent. Jimmy tried to recover. He chuckled nervously, said something about wrapping up, but it landed flat. Clint didn't wait for permission. He sat back down, eyes locked on the host, daring him to ask another question. But Jimmy didn't. He stared at his notes, then into the crowd, as if hoping someone else would take the heat for him. The crowd began to shift. Some stood up, not out of protest, but out of respect. A slow clap broke out. Not for Jimmy. For Clint. It wasn't a walk-off moment. It wasn't a meltdown. It was something worse for Fallon. It was exposure. One final segment remained, and Jimmy had to decide whether he would recover or collapse. Clint had laid his soul bare, even as he eviscerated the format. Now the question was, would Jimmy find the spine to respond like a man, or retreat back into the persona? The clock was ticking, and the lights never stopped rolling. The studio felt colder than before. The lights were still on, the cameras still rolling, but the atmosphere had become heavy, charged with everything that had been said and everything that still lingered in the silence. Jimmy Fallon sat rigid, at his desk, his cue cards untouched, forgotten. Across from him, Clint Eastwood remained seated, his presence as commanding as ever, unflinching in the face of the tension he had carved into the space around them. The crew waited for direction, but none came. The usual rhythm of the show had been shattered, and Jimmy knew it. There was no bouncing back with a celebrity impersonation, no cheeky game to reset the mood. The air was too thick with meaning, and the audience had tasted something real. They would not accept a retreat into pretense. After a long, uneasy pause, Jimmy finally spoke, but not as the host. He dropped the voice, the charm, the rehearsed cadence. He looked Clint in the eyes, and for the first time, let the defensiveness drop. He said what needed to be said. That maybe, just maybe, he had let the show become a reflection of what people expected rather than what he believed in. That somewhere along the way he had chosen safety over substance, and that maybe tonight, as painful and humiliating as it had been, was the wake-up call he needed. Clint didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just nodded once. That slight movement carried the weight of his entire career, a lifetime of commanding respect without ever asking for it. Jimmy turned to the audience. He admitted the interview hadn't gone as planned. That it had gone wrong, not because of conflict, but because it had touched on something deeper. The conflict had ripped open a hole in the surface-level comfort of late-night television and shown people the divide between generations, between intention and impact, between truth and performance. There was a pause, but not the uncomfortable kind anymore. This one was solemn, cleansing. Then Clint stood again, and this time the audience rose with him. Not in frantic applause, but in a gesture of respect rarely earned on that stage. He didn't make a dramatic exit. He didn't throw a final insult. He simply thanked the audience, not for laughing, but for listening. And with that, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a room that would never quite be the same. Jimmy remained seated, eyes lowered for a moment. Then he looked into the camera. What came out wasn't a joke, but a promise. That maybe the show needed to evolve. That maybe it was time to stop treating every conversation as disposable and start honoring the people who had actually lived through something worth hearing. The credits rolled slower than usual. The music played, but it felt subdued, almost respectful. Social media lit up within minutes, flooded with clips, analysis, and stunned reactions. The world wasn't watching. A meltdown. They were witnessing a shift. And while the headlines the next morning would sensationalize the clash, Clint Eastwood humiliates Jimmy Fallon on live TV, Eastwood storms into confrontation, those who had watched it through knew better. They had seen something rare. Not just an argument. A reckoning. The clip of Clint's final words went viral, not because of outrage, but because of clarity. In an industry so often afraid of uncomfortable truths, one man had sat under the lights and refused to be edited. He didn't yell, he didn't beg for attention. He just told the truth. And the world, for once, listened. In the days that followed, the show's producers received letters. Real ones, not tweets. Some from veterans, others from former actors, even a few from politicians. People who said they had felt erased by the modern world and, for the first time in a long time, felt seen again. Clint Eastwood didn't return for another appearance. He didn't need to. His legacy had just written another chapter, not on film but in real time, live, unfiltered. And Jimmy? He changed. Not overnight. Not in dramatic leaps. But his tone softened. His questions grew more thoughtful. He began inviting people who had something to say, not just something to promote. The show didn't lose popularity. It gained depth. The night Clint Eastwood shattered the illusion became the night Jimmy Fallon stopped performing and started listening. It had gone wrong, yes, but maybe it had gone wrong in exactly the right way.